The 19th century is often remembered as the dawn of modern America. Railroads stretching across the frontier, cities rising out of the mud, and a restless nation carving out its future. But behind the smoke of the factories and the clapboard walls of small-town clinics, medicine was still closer to medieval trial and error than the polished science we think of today. And in that uncertain world, the doctor was both healer and gambler, forced to rely on what the body gave them: blood, spit, urine, and sometimes vomit. To us, the thought is grotesque. The idea of a physician taking a spoonful of a patient's bile or bringing a drop of vomit to his lips sounds like a cruel joke. But in early 19th century America, it was considered a sign of seriousness, even dedication. A good doctor was one who wasn't afraid to get close to sickness, to confront it head-on with every sense available. And in those years before lab tests, the tongue was unbelievably one of the most important diagnostic tools. Picture a wooden medical school lecture hall in 1820. The air is heavy with the smell of oil lamps, chalk dust, and something far worse, the pungent odor of specimens laid out for study. At the front, a professor, coat buttoned tight against the winter cold, holds up a small porcelain dish. Inside it, a pale yellow fluid glistens in the lamplight. The students shift uneasily, a few gagging as the professor brings the dish to his lips. This, he declares, is knowledge. The stomach reveals its secrets if only we are willing to taste them. The students scribble furiously, but they know what comes next. One by one, they will be expected to step forward and taste the sample, to test the bitterness, the sourness, the acidity, clues that might distinguish simple indigestion from a gastric fever or a dangerous case of poisoning. It wasn't a sadistic ritual. It was how medicine was taught, in a time when the stethoscope had barely been invented, when microscopes were rare curiosities, and when the frontier doctor might have nothing more than a leather bag and his instincts. Medicine was a matter of direct engagement. And so American physicians followed the traditions passed down from Europe, traditions where tasting urine could confirm diabetes, where the tang of vomit might reveal bile from the liver, or an infection festering deep within the gut. Take Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of America's most famous physicians and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Though he lived in the late 1700s, his influence shaped the next generation of American doctors. Rush was relentless in his examinations of fluids. He wrote extensively on the importance of close inspection of the discharges of the body. His students carried those lessons into the 1800s, sometimes in ways that today make our stomachs turn. It wasn't limited to elite universities either. On the frontier, far from Harvard or Philadelphia's medical colleges, country doctors often had little more than their senses to guide them. If a farmer's child vomited up black fluid, the doctor might dab it with his finger, touch it to his tongue, and declare, "This is blood from the stomach. The fever has turned." If the taste was sour or acidic, perhaps it was bilious in nature, an imbalance of humors that still echoed the ancient ideas of Galen. To the families who watched this ritual, it was both revolting and awe-inspiring. They believed their doctor was braver than disease itself, willing to take the sickness into his own body just to understand it. The trust it inspired was enormous, and in an age when medicine often failed, trust was half the battle. But make no mistake, it was dangerous. Germ theory had not yet taken hold. No one knew of microbes or pathogens lurking in bodily fluids. To taste a patient's vomit was to invite disease directly into one's mouth. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all could pass from one person to another in that instant. Doctors knew they risked their own lives, but many felt it was a necessary sacrifice in the pursuit of knowledge. And so, across the United States, in city hospitals and rural cabins alike, scenes played out that now feel almost nightmarish. A child vomiting into a basin, a mother wringing her hands, and a doctor, weary but resolute, dipping his finger into the mess and raising it to his lips. He grimaces, nods, and says softly, "I know what this is." The strange part is, it often worked. Sweet-tasting urine was indeed a hallmark of diabetes, as Thomas Willis had documented in Europe. Bitter bile could indicate liver disease. Sour vomit pointed to gastric disorders. These primitive taste tests were crude, but they were sometimes accurate, and in the absence of laboratories, they were all physicians had. Still, the line between science and superstition was thin. Some doctors claimed they could tell a patient's entire prognosis from a single taste, boasting of their finely tuned palates. Others dismissed it as folly, relying instead on smell or sight alone. Medical journals of the time occasionally debated the issue, with some writers defending the practice as time-honored and others calling it unhygienic and unworthy. But the truth is, for most physicians of early America, it was simply part of the job. And so, in the flickering light of 19th century clinics, American doctors carried on this unsettling tradition, sipping, tasting, analyzing the very fluids their patients longed to be rid of. To them, vomit was not just waste. It was evidence. It was a message from the body, a riddle that only the bravest, or perhaps the most desperate, were willing to decode. But as the century wore on, whispers of change began to stir. New sciences were arriving from Europe: chemistry, pathology, microbiology. And with them came the promise of tools that could replace the doctor's tongue. Yet for many years still, especially in the hinterlands of America, the old ways persisted. Because when you had nothing else, sometimes all you could do was taste the sickness and hope you had learned enough to understand it. The story of American doctors tasting vomit might sound like folklore, but the evidence is scattered across 19th century medical texts, memoirs, and journals. And the deeper we dig, the stranger and more human the details become. Consider the medical schools of the 1830s and 1840s. By then, the young United States was beginning to establish its own institutions of higher learning, but the resources available to students were still astonishingly primitive. There were no clinical laboratories, no blood tests, and certainly no modern diagnostic machines. Professors lectured endlessly on theory, but when it came to practice, the only available materials were the patients themselves. At Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, one of the most respected schools of its time, students recalled demonstrations where the professor would hold up jars of urine, sputum, or vomit and challenge the class. Tell me what this means. The room would fall silent until a brave student stepped forward, dipped a finger into the sample, and gave it a tentative taste. The exercise wasn't simply theatrical. It was meant to train doctors to think with all of their senses, to engage directly with the clues the body provided. One diary, preserved in the archives of a New England physician named Charles Knowlton, records the unsettling honesty of the practice. In a casual entry from 1831, he noted, "Patient with fever, vomit sour and acrid upon the tongue. I am convinced this is bilious in character. Prescribed calomel." For him, there was no sense of shame or disgust. It was as ordinary as describing the weather. To a modern reader, though, the image is staggering. A country doctor alone in a farmhouse kitchen, lifting a basin of vomit to his lips under the worried gaze of a family. And this was not confined to isolated cases. Early American medical manuals explicitly advised young doctors to use taste when other senses failed. One such guide, published in Boston in 1828, recommended that the bitterness of bilious discharges may be ascertained most readily by application to the tongue. Another text suggested that vomit of an acid quality may be discovered by its sharpness upon taste, when no instrument of chemistry is at hand. Think about that for a moment. These were not fringe instructions, whispered in back rooms. They were printed, published, and taught openly as legitimate medicine. Of course, patients reacted in different ways. Some were horrified. Stories survive of families begging doctors not to touch the vomit, only to be told that it was necessary for diagnosis. Others, oddly enough, were reassured. A doctor who would willingly taste vomit was seen as dedicated, as serious, even heroic. One farmer's wife in Pennsylvania later recalled, "The doctor put his very lips to what made my stomach turn, and I knew then he would do all he could for my boy." But the risks were real. The early 19th century was a breeding ground for epidemics. Cholera, in particular, swept across America in devastating waves in the 1830s and 1840s, leaving tens of thousands dead. And what was the signature symptom of cholera? Violent vomiting. To taste the fluids of a cholera patient was, quite literally, to put your life on the line. Countless doctors contracted the disease while tending to patients. Some survived, many did not. Their sacrifice often went unnoticed, hidden within the statistics of a country grappling with epidemic after epidemic. Still, for all its grotesqueness, the practice occasionally led to genuine breakthroughs. When physicians noticed that some patients' vomit carried an unusually sweet or fruity odor and taste, it eventually guided them toward the recognition of metabolic conditions, what we now know as diabetic ketoacidosis. When vomit was excessively bitter, it pointed toward gallbladder disease or liver dysfunction. Crude as it was, the human tongue served as a kind of primitive laboratory test, centuries before machines could confirm the same conclusions. Yet not all experiences were so clinical. There were tales of students fainting in lecture halls after being forced to taste particularly rancid samples. Some vomited themselves, leading to a grotesque chain reaction in the classroom. Professors sometimes scolded them, claiming their weak stomachs meant they were unfit for medicine. After all, a true physician must overcome disgust in the pursuit of truth. And then there were the skeptics. By the mid-19th century, American medicine was beginning to change. The discoveries of European scientists, men like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, hinted that disease might come from invisible organisms rather than imbalances of bile or humors. Younger doctors began to question whether tasting vomit was not only unpleasant, but outright dangerous and unscientific. Medical journals of the 1850s reveal this tension. In one heated article from 1854, a physician argued, "The continued insistence on gustatory examination of vomit is both needless and perilous. With chemical reagents now more accessible, it is folly to risk one's health and dignity thus." But not everyone was ready to abandon the old ways. Many rural doctors scoffed at European theories and clung to tradition. In isolated towns, far from academic centers, they continued to practice as they had been taught. As late as the 1860s, accounts still appear of American physicians tasting vomit during outbreaks of dysentery and yellow fever. What emerges from these stories is a picture of medicine in transition, torn between the old, almost medieval reliance on the senses and the new, laboratory-based science just beginning to take root. The image of a doctor sipping vomit seems grotesque now, but in its own strange way, it captures the essence of early American medicine, desperate, experimental, and deeply human. Because beneath the shock and disgust lies something universal, the willingness of doctors to put themselves at risk for the sake of their patients. They lack the tools we take for granted, but they refuse to stop searching for answers, even if it meant swallowing what others could not bear to look at. By the second half of the 19th century, American medicine stood at a crossroads. The era of the vomit-tasting doctor was not yet entirely gone, but the intellectual ground beneath it was crumbling. The reason was simple: the birth of modern science. Across the Atlantic, discoveries were unraveling centuries of medical tradition. In France, Louis Pasteur demonstrated that invisible microorganisms, germs, caused fermentation and disease. In Germany, Robert Koch isolated the bacterium responsible for tuberculosis. Suddenly, the ancient idea of the four humors and the reliance on taste or smell to detect imbalance seemed hopelessly outdated. American physicians read these reports with fascination, but also with skepticism. Many rural doctors doubted that germs too small to see could truly explain illness. Still, the evidence was mounting. As microscopes became more available in American cities, Younger physicians began abandoning old sensory methods in favor of laboratory observation. Why risk tasting vomit when you could test it under a microscope? By the 1870s, leading medical schools in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston introduced formal laboratory instruction. Students learned to analyze fluids using chemical reagents instead of their tongues. Hospitals began setting up clinical laboratories, modest rooms with test tubes, alcohol burners, and early microscopes. This revolution was slow, uneven, and resisted by traditionalists, but the tide was turning. And yet, remnants of the old ways clung on stubbornly. In the memoirs of Civil War surgeons, there are accounts of doctors describing the acrid bite or bitter gall taste of vomit as late as the 1860s. In remote areas, far from the cities, physicians often had no microscopes or reagents at all. Their senses were still their only diagnostic tools. Imagine being a doctor in frontier America, summoned by horseback to a log cabin, a child retching into a bucket, the family pleading for answers. There is no laboratory, no electricity, not even running water. You rely on the firelight, your hands, your nose, and yes, sometimes your tongue. For such doctors, the old science was not backwardness. It was survival. But by the dawn of the 20th century, the practice was finally in retreat. Germ theory had triumphed, chemistry had matured, and diagnostic tests had multiplied. In 1900, the idea of a physician tasting vomit was already beginning to sound like a grim anecdote from the old days. Medical journals stopped mentioning it, and new generations of doctors were horrified by the stories. By the 1920s, the practice had virtually disappeared from living memory. So what do we make of this bizarre chapter? Was it merely superstition, or was it a courageous, if misguided, attempt to help patients with the tools at hand? Historians tend to view it as both. On one hand, tasting vomit exposed doctors to tremendous risk, and many almost certainly contracted deadly diseases as a result. On the other hand, it provided genuine diagnostic clues at a time when no alternatives existed. In a strange way, it reflects the relentless determination of early physicians to wrestle answers from the body itself, no matter the cost. But there's another layer here, one that touches on psychology and culture. To patients, a doctor's willingness to taste vomit was not just medical, it was symbolic. It showed commitment, courage, even sacrifice. In an era when medicine was still deeply personal, when doctors lived in their communities and were called by name to family homes, such acts built trust. A doctor who would endure disgust and danger for you seemed worthy of faith. And in medicine, faith can be as powerful as science. Of course, not everyone admired the practice. Some contemporaries found it grotesque, even immoral. A satirical article in an 1850s newspaper mocked physicians as connoisseurs of sickly broths, suggesting they were more interested in their own curiosity than their patients' well-being. But satire aside, the cultural memory of the vomit-tasting doctor never quite vanished. Even today, scattered references crop up in local histories, museum exhibits, and obscure corners of medical literature. What's perhaps most astonishing is how recent it all is. We tend to think of such grotesque practices as medieval, the stuff of plague doctors and alchemy. Yet here it was alive and well in the America of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. Barely 150 years ago, in a country already boasting railroads and telegraphs, doctors were still dipping their fingers into vomit to decide on treatment. The irony is sharp. As America raced toward modernity in industry and politics, its medicine still bore the marks of a far older world. It was a medicine of touch, of smell, of taste, a medicine that demanded not distance, but intimacy. Doctors literally shared the sickness of their patients, sometimes to their own ruin. And maybe that's why the story shocks us so deeply today. In an age where medicine often feels cold, technological, and detached, it's almost impossible to imagine a physician putting their lips to something so revolting just to help someone. It disgusts us, but it also humbles us. Because behind the horror lies something profoundly human, a willingness to suffer so another might live. By the mid-20th century, the tale of vomit-tasting doctors had faded in a legend, whispered as a cautionary example of the dark ages of medicine. But history is rarely so simple. Those doctors were not fools. They were products of their time, working with the limited tools available, guided by the belief that knowledge was worth any cost. And as unsettling as it is, maybe that's the lesson. Medicine has always advanced through people willing to cross lines of fear, disgust, and even danger. Today, we no longer taste vomit to diagnose disease, but we send probes into bloodstreams, harvest tissues, and run experiments on the tiniest fragments of life. What seems grotesque to us now was once a frontier, and what we do today may seem just as strange to future generations. So the next time you hear about the American doctors who drank vomit, resist the temptation to laugh it off as absurd. Instead, see it for what it was, a story of desperation, courage, and the relentless human hunger for knowledge. It is grotesque, yes, but it is also, in its own strange way, inspiring. Because history is not only made of triumphs, it is also made of the things people were willing to endure in pursuit of truth. And sometimes, that truth had a taste no one could forget.